Hey, really excited to have you in person. The last time we did this was digitally, and now we're going to be in person at Geeks on the Beach. So looking forward to just chat about what's happened to the Philippines in 2024, see what's happening in 2025.
Good to have you. Yeah, have to be back here.
Yeah, I know, right? Partying in Philippines.
Welcome to Cebu.
I know, right? Partying in Cebu. Now parties are like, hey, talking about technology.
Yeah, of course, it's the same thing, yeah.
It's the same thing, but at least we get to do it in a little bit more casual environment.
Yeah.
You recently came up with a report and I just saw you present as a keynote, then I was the keynote right after you.
Yes.
So what was like the key takeaways from your report?
Sure. Every year we do different reports, alternating from an ecosystem report towards like more focus on insightful, moving the ecosystem to the right direction. This year we launched the Philippine Horizons Report, specifically on ASEAN, Philippines in the ASEAN landscape. So I think the past 2 years at 2023, when we were talking, I was traveling around with my wife around Southeast Asia, partly to just decompress, but realize that it was a good opportunity to learn what's happening around Southeast Asia. Whether you're a tech founder, an investor, an enabler, policymaker, what aspects of it worked because the Philippines is behind. How can we catch up if we add all the best use case and say, where is the Philippines in this archetype of being an innovation hub? So that's how it started. And then over time, we realized that 2023 was, we could predict where things would work. Vietnam would be 3 years ahead of the Philippines, Thailand 4, and 7 for Indonesia. And then this year changed when I traveled around. Things are becoming more the solidification of the next ecosystem, or what the WEF is calling the intelligent age. That's going to be the bedrock. So Southeast Asia is now building themselves with deep tech, semiconductor in Malaysia, data centers in Thailand, but the Philippines is still figuring out what that means to be a digital ecosystem. So this report is really saying, we have to do this now. It's a now or never opportunity. And if we want to create, if there's any platform or industry that any entrepreneur can have the same chance of success, whether that's financially or for society, technology has that. And this is what we want to create as a message, that these are the gaps that we're seeing. These are the best practices in ASEAN. Let's get to work. And we have a few years to make this happen before it's a whole different ball game, and it might be too late to actually compete.
Yeah. It might be too late to compete. What do you mean by that? Do you mean that Philippines is falling behind in terms of infrastructure policy? What do you mean by that phrase?
I think the good thing about the administration now in the Philippines, it's very pro-economic policies. Right now, they're really pushing for the Create More Act, which reduces the taxes for corporates, right? It's from 25, they're going for 20. It could be lesser. But the Philippines, we have an innovative startup act. It's already a law, passed through 2019, right? There's 3 aspects of it: startup visa, startup taxes, and the startup venture fund or funding. The startup venture fund is already starting with co-investment partnerships. So we invest. We're the first to be awarded that. Whatever we invest, they will match it. I think Singapore and Malaysia and so forth, right? What's missing is the fund of funds on the startup venture fund. So that's slowly moving, but the visas and taxes, which are like the bedrock of attracting talent and stimulating entrepreneurs to start taking risks and creating solutions, is lacking. And that's something that we want to push now, because if you want to see everyone doing it, whether you're attracting or not, we have a beautiful country. We have all the islands. It's ripe for disruption and innovation. But without that, people will be like, the investors are going to take that risk? Probably not. So.
And I think a previous guest, like Jay Fuhada, was like saying there's a bit of a mystery because Southeast Asia, there's growth, there's venture capital. Obviously, a lot of that capital flew into Singapore. First, obviously, as a regional hub, Delaware is hot. So I think everyone understands Singapore as port of entry for foreign direct investment makes sense. But it feels like Philippines fell behind versus Vietnam and Indonesia. So the past 5 to 10 years has really been a story about Indonesia, 300 million people, also an archipelago, but doesn't speak English. Vietnam, also about 100 million people plus, doesn't speak English, but obviously focused. And then the Philippines has a lot of those fundamental same things, right? Similar GDP per capita, 100 million plus people, everybody's English educated. Huge technology educated diaspora that's working in America and tech. So it feels like Philippines missed out on that wave. So I'm just curious, what does your report, or what's your thinking because of the report?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. I think as GPs, we are always optimistic and bullish to bring in invest market potential, right? You're saying we're the second largest, most young here. and so forth. And it's still going up. The GDP works, the numbers are right. But at the end of the day, it's the policies that attract innovation for the Philippines are operating here. So I'll give you a good example here. If I ask you, is there a local startup champion dominating an industry outside of the conglomerate-backed fintech? Let's put that as an exception. There's none. Who's leading? Regional investors. That could be a recurring theme, and that would only mean that there won't be a space for startups in the Philippines to compete. How did Indonesia do it? Indonesia was pro-Indonesia first, right? And what happened now with ByteDance and Goto and what they're doing with Apple, it's really protecting and making sure locals have the advantage first in order to create that nation-building aspect of it. I think that's the bedrock of what they're saying. But at the end of the day, what's lagging behind is we are a service economy. Global population, they can always come back. But why is it so hard? Corporate taxes. When you look at ease of doing business, how long it takes to just get a business up and running. In Singapore, you can do it over a weekend. Here, you can hear some cases after 6 months. And then that's not even considering when you need to close the business. Closing the business is a different story, right? So all these things need to be done. It's a work between two agencies, two groups right now within the policy-making side. The ISA, the Innovative Startup Act, they're calling themselves the ISA Committee, DOST, DICT, DTI, which is the Trade Ministry, Ministry, and the Science Technology Ministry. They're part of the ISA Committee. They're working with the law. Then you have NEDA. NEDA is the infrastructure agency that has a lot of capital to use to invest in this space. They have a National Innovation Council. They should be working together. And that's something they're currently building out. There's a road and share it to you that they're finally brought out to prioritize. They have so many priorities and they've put up specific metrics like total ecosystem value, how many unicorns to be made. By 2030, 4 unicorns. If you consider GCash and Maya to be the next unicorn, that only means 2. And you still have 6 years. We could do definitely more. So with all these roadmaps and all these aspects that they're trying to build out, what I'm saying in the report is taxes and visas. Start there. Let the floodgate go in. We can always just react after that. But without that, there's no feedback system for us to say things are happening. And it's already happening, right? So if you're looking at the funding this year, 2024, almost 90% of all the funding is growth stage startups. But that's not indicative of innovation growth. But it does say there's investor confidence in this in the country. That financing is up to, you're looking at maturing startups that can take it. Fundamentally, especially in Southeast Asia, profitability is the most important thing right now. We have those. But if you have visas and taxes, light speed, right? So I think that's where what we're missing, and that's where I'm super excited because now it's all a positive. But if we work together as an ecosystem, we can do 2025.
Yeah, all of that makes sense. Making business easier to set up, to run, all those things are also important. The last podcast that you did with us, you also talked about taxation is a big part of it as well, because the ecosystem currently doesn't do the right set of taxes that are startup friendly for startups. What's interesting as well is that I think the shape of that is interesting because you have your regional VCs that focus on Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia as their, let's say, core, and then you look at Philippines as an outpost. So there's associates in the Philippines and Thailand. Malaysia is somewhere in between because to some extent people from Singapore cover Malaysia as well. But I think there's an interesting dynamic that's there. One of the concerns that I've heard is that Thailand's startup ecosystem and the funding ecosystem has become much more corporate VC dominated because the regional or the global funds are not looking at that market. So the corporate VCs end up having the majority of that. And how do we see that for like the Philippines in terms of trajectory, in terms of that?
Yeah, I love that question because it really opens up the under the rug situation, right? Majority, if not all, I see the Philippines going 2 routes. If the policies work, it could be a Vietnam or the Golden Star, the North Star, Indonesia. But at this point, it seems CVCs or the corporate back ones are really being ahead of the curve, right? Sooner or later, the IPOs are going to come, but that's going to be GCash and Maya. But the multiplier effect is a different story from what we know, right? Every country in ASEAN hopes to be a Silicon Valley, a David versus Goliath. But then Thailand, the Philippines could be like a Seattle, right? There's nothing wrong with it. I think what we're trying to push for as a GP also is that the underlying aspect of moving capital towards independent startups also means that there is more opportunity, which creates a multiplier effect for impact, right? It could be rosy, but for me, it's very important because if you want to create more people wanting to innovate long term, there's three things I would, when I talk about just like innovation. Short term, all right? Short term, you can do skilling, right? Mid-term, you can focus on being an entrepreneur. But at the end of the day, if you want to do long term, you need to do development. These two right here, we can always upskill, but then if you want to keep everyone in the Philippines and supporting the Philippines, you need the mid and long-term strategies to work. That's the reason why Vietnam, when families start having kids, almost 50% of all their savings go towards education. That's why the high study abroad coming back to Vietnam is super high, right? We don't have that. What ends up happening is we serve the rest of the world. Nothing wrong with it. Hence why a maturing ecosystem, a maturing industry within our space is the service economy. HR outsourcing, until even now, even the outsourcing side, we have like the online gambling and whatnot. Then you also have things as all the transcribing, the manual transcribing of AI is happening here. But what's behind, after that is a different story because we're not building data centers. We're still finishing up our electrification and connectivity. So the visas and taxes is a good way to build the floodgate, and everyone else will move towards creating that as the most important priority for Philippines.
Yeah, I think I love that fork in the road, right? Because like you said, one side is it becomes a Silicon Valley, it can be a global and regional hub. Another side is more of a Seattle. So a lot of that valley is being captured by current conglomerates. I think it's quite interesting because I think the feedback that we are getting from startups is like, hey, I have to choose between one of the conglomerates in terms of the family chain because there aren't regional funds that can do the next stage. And then obviously, if you come from a conglomerate, then maybe the pathing might be more towards a local stock exchange listing, or it could be an acquisition by the mothership at that point of time. Any advice that you give to founders as they start to think through some of that venture capital or funding stack?
Yes, maybe I'll start with 2026. The estimates right now is by 2026, the Philippines would become a middle high income country. So when that happens, developmental aid will start pulling out of the Philippines. Then you have to also consider the geopolitical issues around us, right? So when you have that, what's left of us to actually focus on developing our education, our upskilling, and so forth. So you're seeing all these variables working to the advantage of corporates, which is great. But then sometimes corporates are looking to not develop people, but actually hire now. So what happens? The competitiveness of Filipinos locally wanting to get those jobs might not be available to them now or even in the future, because it could happen where everyone else is just being flown in to do the same thing. I could argue that from outside of the lack of talent, lack of population of Singapore, the foreign talent comes in, but there's always been a question of the rift between locals first or foreigners, right? But the Philippines, we have 100 million. The education part needs to happen now because it takes about 20 years to develop the whole pipeline of talents. What's the visas and taxes again is attracting the diaspora coming back and foreign talents being welcomed here. Imagine a work visa for you. If you're coming here to work for a conglomerate, and if you're a startup foreigner coming in, it's the same buy-in. It doesn't make sense. So I think that's a crucial part. Although I would give props to corporates here, they're really pushing for a balance of Filipino talent. I think props to the Boiteses, the Ayalas. They've done a great job doing that. But there's a disparity between how many they can take on with 100 million plus a very fast growth on birth rate, right? We'll see. Maybe the next report I'll talk about that, but that really gives me something to think about.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is the fundamental, which is that I think in America, most people think about venture capital as primarily independent funds and corporate VC funds being a very small, like 10%, for example, of the entire mix. Versus I think what we're saying now is if you look at Thailand, corporate venture capital is the majority of the stack, and then independent venture capital is a minority of that stack. So I think Philippines, the story is unclear. We will figure out, and I think that's where I think the journey has to be. One thing you mentioned is about geopolitical changes as well. So we now have the new Trump administration, so we now know who they're going to be for the next 4 years. And obviously, I think that's the first order impacts in terms of tariffs, in terms of policy, decoupling between USA and China that will continue to intensify. But there's also second order impacts that also happen as well. So could you share a little bit more about what you think from a Filipino's perspective what a Trump administration means for the Philippines market, especially a technology one?
In general, Southeast Asia is the neutral territory, whether that's China or the U.S. wanting to take most of the soft power and influence towards policies, like tariffs even. That's going to be, this is going to be the neutral ground. What's going to change is the fundraising landscape for GPs, right? Depending on how Trump is going to work with China or not work with China, then the mix of investors and institutional investors coming in to be LPs for GPs would change the market drastically, right? I think the pros, though, is from historically speaking of Trump, when it comes to technology innovation, regulation isn't as fast, which means innovation can actually move a bit more fluid in that sense. So there's good and bad things for any administration, but for the Philippines, what this administration has been doing has created a good balance of this space. And I think, as you could see, the past few years from the last administration, a lot of the inflows and a lot of the contribution from the country was actually coming from e-gambling as well, right? Although the infrastructure has changed and they have publicly banned POGOs, there's a new definition that they're going for. Regardless of what that is, it really shows our biggest competitive advantage that the global economy wants to tap for the Philippines. And philosophically, if the world was a globalized world in its fullest sense, the Philippines could be the service economy for every country or every region, right? How to make that happen is a question of who's going to have the hearing ear of this administration. For me, it waiting for things to happen, but my biggest priority right now is to have that ISA law to be fully implemented.
Yeah. So I think let's disaggregate that into U.S. Philippines, and then we'll talk a little bit more about U.S. China leading to China Philippines, I would say. So for U.S. China, let me say that again. For USA Philippines, one thing I've heard is that a lot of Filipinos are pro-Trump. Could you share a little bit more about that aspect?
Yeah, I think not getting too political about it, but from the administration last year and compared to how Trump is, Duterte was even called Trump of the East, right? So I think in terms of ideology, values, how they attracted people to be on their side, I think that's definitely very similar. And I think for the Philippines, some would say the Philippines needs an iron fist to really provide this whole benefit to all society, right? And I think they always say like Imperial Manila gets all the best perks and benefits for being there. That's 40% of total tax contribution goes back to Metro Manila. 60% has to be split by everyone else. Then now you have to think about another factor where BARM, southern part, the Muslim Mindanao region, they want to be autonomous. So all these things are happening all at the same time. And now, even as early as now, conversations are even going, is the Duterte family coming back in or not? But going back to ideology, strong supporter for both. And I think in terms of what the conversation or the narrative is, it's really showing that if you want to serve the people, you need to communicate what they believe in and what they want seen. And I think this current administration is showing that outside of just talking about it is really walking the talk. But sometimes the trickle effect for laws and policies to work takes more than 10 years to happen. So that remains to be seen, especially when Philippines is in between both and we're in this like very strategic position, especially with the current geopolitical situation of China and the US.
I think what's interesting is that for Trump administration, they're very focused on trade surplus versus deficit. And so I think they are already shared that initially they were friendly to Vietnam, but now they're very much making noises about that relationship with Vietnam. I don't believe that it's going to have the same issue with the Philippines in terms of the relationship. It doesn't really feel like Philippines comes up as a problem for the Trump administration. But obviously there's going to be some proposals around tariffs on global imports to America, as well as. But is there any interaction with the tariff structure or global trade, deglobalization with Philippines?
I'll put it this way. Majority of the imports on Lazada and Shopee actually come from China.
Yeah.
So if you cut that off, then it's gonna choke a lot of consumers here, and that would be really bad for any administration, right? What I'm most worried about isn't that. My biggest worry now is AI taking a lot of the jobs of the BPO sector. And it's one of the largest contributors for this economy, right? Whether that's inflow or remittances coming back in. I'm more worried about that because even if there's upskilling happening, it's a question of how do we keep up, right? Any Southeast Asian country, what I've seen works as the best strategy is find the best use case that worked for the Middle East or the US or the EU in regulation, localize it, and then make it in a sandbox position. It doesn't work in the next 6 months, rechange it. But here it's more of put the laws in, put the IRR, implementing rules and regulation, and never change. So that approach needs to change, especially if you're competing in that space. So if I have to worry about anything now, AI is really creeping in. Nobody wants to talk about it, but we're one of the largest countries to actually adopt it immediately already. But in terms of like the workforce that will be disrupted, it's creeping in faster than anything.
What's interesting is that I've noticed a lot of fear around that piece about AI displacing BPO and call center jobs. So I was at lunch with several Filipinos. They felt like it's a very big concern. Of course, when I talk to people in the BPO industry, they don't feel as worried, I would say. Where do you think that's going to be? Do you think AI will truly displace these BPOs? What is going to happen to those jobs in the BPOs?
I think it's going to make the whole workforce more competitive to stay in, right? So at the end of the day, AI in this space is optimization and having better margins, right? I think in this space, we're seeing more, it's actually the call of the corporate or the BPO to say, do we keep all the jobs or do we start migrating most of it to AI? The right ethical way of doing it is how do you keep them with AI supporting their workflows? That's a different story in itself, a strategic thing. On the startup side is fairly interesting because as part of what we did in the report, one of the reasons why there was a spurt of investments on a seed stage was they've optimized their costs on a fundamental road to profitability by actually using a lot of AI processes to actually reduce their costs on that side. But that still means you lose manpower at the end of the day. So I think that's something we'll be talking about in the next ecosystem report. But I think what's happened here, I think you should definitely bring in Jack Madrid from IBPAP that's really focusing on this topic. But we've been talking and working hand in hand to really figure out, because I also think that the tech ecosystem, if something happens in the BPO industry, that talent there is perfect for the ecosystem. So there is a net if there's anything. But again, that net can only work going back, taxes and visas. So there is that. And I see that as the amount of millions of Filipinos are in that space and they're already accustomed to American standards and workflows that make sense to be talents for the ecosystem.
Oh, interesting to hear the potential for recycling that BPO loss of talent into, I think, the startup sector. I think going to the second chapter, which is the China-Philippines relationship. So you mentioned that obviously a lot of the imports for Filipino consumers, Chinese imports. And of course, I think we're going to expect Chinese exporters, from their perspective, going to shift and export more volume to Southeast Asia. I think Indonesia started having taxation on Chinese imports. I think there's one. They also started banning Temu and other platforms. I think Vietnam's the other way. I think they're not choosing to do any of those trade barriers. So what do you think Philippines is going to land out? Is it going to erect more trade barriers? Do you think it's going to continue being open to Chinese imports? How do you see that?
So indicative this year, majority of the cars sold in the Philippines were actually Chinese EV brands. So I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon for the reason that it's a win for the consumers.
Right.
Better value, better technology. It's just going to upgrade our lives here without paying a leg for it, right? So I don't think that's going to be the case. What is very crucial though is how China is looking at the Philippines as a strategic position within this dispute. So there's a lot of tension, especially on the West Philippine Sea. That's becoming more of a narrative. You can hear more people saying, "Oh, if it's a China brand, they're going to keep the usual narrative, right? Oh, they're going to use our data and whatnot, right?" So I think it's a balance in a sense. I think technology-wise, it's made our lives easier. On the policy side, they build fast. They build fast, right? So whoever provides, they were supposed to, or at least majority of what was promised for the Duterte administration for infrastructure, and that came from China. But we haven't seen anything yet, right? So this administration is actually creating that balance of either renegotiating it and figuring out, are there other takers to actually build this whole infrastructure that was already promised, right? And there's an upside there because it's already approved, it's done, but then who wants to take it? That becomes a competitive notion for growth for us.
Yeah, I think the Western Philippines Sea, the South China Sea, I think the Vietnamese also call it another name as well.
Yes.
So very much a flashpoint
Correct.
that's there. And I think also causing a lot of that geopolitical tension. Obviously, I think there's a lot of people who are being very patriotic or nationalistic, depending if it's the other side, about that territory. When you think about the next kind of 4 years, any big trends that you see in terms of the market to wrap things up?
If there was anything interesting in this space outside of just like what the Philippines could look like, is actually the southern part of the Philippines, BARM, especially close to Kalimantan, which is going to be the next metropolis of Indonesia. Then, of course, you have Malaysia and the same island too, right? A lot of the development and the talent that's being brought in, their closest neighbor is actually the Philippines. If there was an opportunity for any entrepreneur looking at a 10, 20-year horizon, BARM being built up again for the Philippines and that island of Borneo, crazy upside. But that's way across the horizon. My job right now is to make sure, outside of investing in soon-to-be unicorns, is really making sure we have unicorns or great startups that just don't come from Metro Manila. My job is done when I can find one in a small island that can provide the whole township with great long-term jobs. And when that's done, I think I could throw my hat out of the ring.
On that note, thank you so much for sharing about the Philippines and the entire market.
Thank you, Jeremy, for supporting the Philippines and coming to the Philippines. Welcome to the Philippines.